Good evening, and welcome to SkepTalk, the monthly speaker series hosted by the Bay Area Skeptics. Before tonight's presentation, a few words about Bay Area Skeptics. As North America's oldest skeptical organization, we are dedicated to promoting critical thinking, logic, and rational thought. In the 1970s and 80s, scientists such as Carl Sagan and magicians such as James Randi established the scientific skepticism movement out of concern about the popular fondness for pseudoscience and the lack of public science literacy. Scientific skepticism embraces evidence-based civil discourse on health, education, consumer protection, and especially the investigation of extraordinary claims. Using the scientific method, we hope to promote skeptical inquiry to reduce irrational thinking in society. This talk is supported by Bay Area Skeptics members such as you. Please visit us at baskeptics.org or join us on Facebook, Twitter, and Meetup. Consider supporting us through convenient monthly donations via Patreon. Patrons receive premiums such as discounts and free t-shirts for our annual Skeptical Conference. But more importantly, members help us make the world just a little more reasonable and rational. And now, tonight's speaker.
Good evening. I'm Eugenie Scott. I'm the president of Bay Area Skeptics and your host tonight. Welcome to the second Thursday SkepTalk of the Bay Area Skeptics. Our speaker tonight is Dr. Joseph L. Graves, Jr., Professor of Biological Sciences in the Department of Nanoengineering at North Carolina A&T. He received a bachelor's degree from Oberlin College and a Ph.D. in Evolutionary, Environmental, and Systematic Biology at Wayne State University. His early research was on the biology and genetics of aging using Drosophila, that's a fly for you physics folks, selected either for short lifespans or for longevity. The concept of adaptation continues in his current research on antimicrobial nanomaterials, much of which is done in conjunction with an NSF-funded Center of Excellence, the Precision Microbial Engineering Research Center in North Carolina, of which he is Associate Director and co-PI. Among his many publications in this area is his 2021 book, Principles of Antimicrobial Nanomaterials. Now, as interesting as this work is, however, we have invited him tonight to talk about a different long-term scholarly and practical interest of his, the subject of race and racism, both in the history of science and in the United States in general. Drawing from his background in evolutionary biology and genetics, he has written several books on this topic, including his 2001 The Emperor's New Clothes, Biological Theories of Race at the Millennium. This well-received book was followed in 2005 by The Race Myth, Why We Pretend Race Exists in America, and his best-known book on this subject with biological anthropologist Alan Goodman, Racism, Not Race, Answers to Frequently Asked Questions. This book was listed by Kirkus Reviews as a best book in the nonfiction category for 2021. It just came out in paperback. His most recent book is his 2022 autobiography, A Voice in the Wilderness. A pioneering biologist explains how evolution can help us solve our biggest problems. It was very favorably reviewed in the January 2023 Science News. Among his many service activities, he's on the board of directors of the National Center for Science Education. So thank you. He also has, as have I, served on the advisory committee for the AAAS Dialogue on Science, Ethics, and Religion, where he advised seminaries in Illinois and Ohio regarding incorporating science into the training of professional clergy. At an early age, he became interested in chess, which he credits with contributing to his early academic success. He gives back via the Greensboro YMCA chess program. Joe, we are delighted to have you with Bay Area Skeptics tonight. Thanks so much for being here.
Eugenie, thank you for the invitation. But I do have to correct you on a couple of things.
Okay, please
do. People
do.
often confuse North Carolina A&T State University for AT&T. For those of you on the West Coast that are not familiar with the historically Black university universe, North Carolina A&T State University is the largest public historically Black university in America. And we are on track to become the first Research One historically Black university in America, with a plan to submit our application for that status by 2028. In addition, I was summarily thrown out of the Joint School for Nanoscience and Nanoengineering for reasons that might become apparent in this talk. And now I am simply in the Department of Biology at North Carolina A&T. But thank you for the very kind introduction, Eugenie.
Well, as it happens, the internet is a wonderful place, and I had a lot of fun today tracking you down and reading Wikipedia pages and bio sketches of you in various places. But of course, the internet is also a very permanent place. So once something is up, it is very confusing. The good news is that at least for the promo materials, we used a current photograph.
Yeah, I had a whole lot more hair in the stuff on the internet.
Some of the early, yeah. Every once in a while, when I was still working and giving a lot more talks than I give today, people would dig out these ancient photographs of me, like from the 90s, when I had really short hair and it was dark. And as I was like, maybe you should have tried a little harder. But anyway, regardless, you have a very distinguished professional career, and your work on helping the public understand, and your scientific colleagues as well, of course, understand the concept of race is very well known in the field. I mentioned to a couple, we got Joe Graves talking to us. Oh, this is great. I'm going to tune in. So we're looking forward very much to hearing your ideas today. So why don't you go ahead and give your talk? Those of you listening on YouTube, be sure to jot down your questions, and we'll come back to Joe later on after his talk and see if he can answer them for you. I'm sure he will. Go ahead, Joe. Thanks.
Fantastic. So let's get this show on the road. All right. So you know who I am. I began to think about why and how people thought racially in our society in the early 1990s. As Eugenie has told you, my first book on this subject, The Emperor's New Clothes, Biological Theories of Race at the Millennium, was published in 2001. And what that book provides the reader is a history of the race concept in the Western world. Now, a few years later, I followed that up with a sequel, The Race Myth. And what the race myth addresses is the ongoing social pathologies that exist in our society precisely because people think racially. Now, I have to tell you that honestly, when I finished The Race Myth, I really hoped that I would never have to write another book about race again, because the scientific issues are so apparently clear that it was like dropping the mic. It's like, I'm done with this, because despite the fact that many people think that my primary scholarship is about race, it actually isn't. I'm an evolutionary geneticist, and I study other problems. This is what I do at night when I get home. It's not my day job. But you were all around for what happened between 2004 and 2018. And my colleague, Alan Goodman, called me up and said, Joe, we really do need to deal with these ongoing misconceptions about race in this society. And things had actually gotten worse over that decade, not better. So we decided to collaborate on Racism, Not Race, Answers to Frequently Asked Questions, which was published in December of 2021 and received the awards that Eugenie mentioned at the beginning of the show. Now, my next book, A Voice in the Wilderness, came out in September of 2022, and its purpose was to acquaint readers with what it meant to be me in evolutionary biology. And for those of you who don't know, I am actually the first African-American to have ever earned a Ph.D. in evolutionary biology. And it was a very unexpected and tortuous path, which I talk about in part one of the book. And then part 2, I talk about why evolution is such an important discipline for the biological sciences and how it can be deployed to solve some of our most vexing and ongoing problems, including issues like science and social justice. Now, there are some excellent resources that you might not know about. There is the Race Are We So Different website, which is associated with the traveling race exhibit that was put together by the American Association of Anthropologists. We happen to have a copy of the exhibit in North Carolina right now, but as you might have suspected, given the dramatic shift to the right in American racial politics in North Carolina, there has been a concerted effort by our conservative and racist legislature to prevent this exhibit from being supported with public funds. You may know about the collection of essays, Is Race Real, from the Social Science Research Council. The film Race, Power, and Illusion is a 3-part documentary that was produced by California Newsreel. I remember actually filming it in the Bay Area. Larry Edelman was the lead on that project. Part 1, The Difference Between Us, is a part that really deals with the science of human biological variation. It was all filmed before the publication of the Human Genome Project, so it is somewhat dated, but the principles that we discussed in part 1 are still true. And in fact, everything we know about genomic research in humans since that film came out have been validated in spades. Also, there's the Encyclopedia of Race and Racism, and I was the associate editor responsible for all of the entries in genetics, evolution, and anthropology. All right, so my co-author in Racism, Not Race is my good friend and colleague, Dr. Alan Goodman, who is professor of biological anthropology at Hampshire College in Amherst, Massachusetts. He has also served as the president of the American Anthropological Association, amongst many other honors. Now, in Racism, Not Race, we provide concise and accessible answers to the questions about race and racism. Now, these questions were gleaned from conversations with our students, educators, policymaker friends, and family. And our book is designed for readers who want to work towards human equity and readers who are nervous about saying the wrong thing. And in many cases, these two groups overlap. So to give you a quick run through of the book, in Chapter 1, we set the table with definitions of race, racism, and human biological variation. Chapter 2, how did race come to be and why is it still so important? Chapter 3, everything you wanted to know about genetics and race. Chapter 4, everything you might want to know about racism. Chapter 5, why do races differ in disease incidence? Chapter 6, life history, aging, and mortality. Chapter 7, athletics, bodies, and abilities. Chapter 8, races, brains, and behaviors. Chapter 9, driving while black and other everyday struggles with institutional racism. Chapter 10, DNA and ancestry testing. Chapter 11, race names and race mixing. In Chapter 12, we present our vision of what our world might look like if we could successfully dismantle structural racism. Now, here's an example of the format of the book. The book was designed to be in a question-answer format. So in the introduction, what is race? Race is real and not real. How many races are there? What do geneticists mean by the structure of human variation? How does human biological variation come about? If race isn't biological, how do you explain the differences we see? What is social construction? What is racism? So these sorts of questions appear throughout all the chapters in the book, and then we give short, concise answers. But I have to tell you, the book is assiduously documented. Because quite frankly, for those of you who are not persons of African descent, who have had careers in the academy, there's a different level of expectation for me when I talk about any topic compared to that of my colleagues who are not of African descent. So we made sure that we had impeccable documentation for everything we said in this book. Now, let's begin with the elephant in the living room. So, race is not a scientific concept. You've probably heard this claim. It's become a platitude amongst scholars in the humanities and the social sciences. But it turns out that this claim fails because it's actually conflating two very different concepts. The first is the biological race concept, which has morphed through various understandings and sets of definitions across the history of the biological sciences. And the other concept is the socially constructed or socially defined race concept. Now, for people who are unfamiliar, and that's usually most people, because I've been talking about and writing about this subject for well over 30 years now, most people don't realize that biology, in its infancy in the Western world, is not the biology that we understand today. In fact, the biological race concept and pretty much all of the concepts in biology began on a special creationist foundation. In other words, naturalists were attempting to understand God's creation by observations in the natural world. Now, the first biological race concept really focused on morphology or physical attributes, what we call the phenotype. In the 19th century, the biological race concept then moved towards using the geographical location of the organisms in question as a means of classifying them into various racial groups. Now, you should note that I use the term organisms, not humans, because it is also a mistake to think that the biological race concept was primarily driven by the study of human beings. It was not. Now, I will also point out, however, that the need to classify human beings for the purposes of supporting colonialism, genocide, and slavery also played a role in how naturalists thought about other organisms. And so why the race concept wasn't itself specifically designed to deal with people, dealing with people played a role in how naturalists thought about other organisms. And that is why Alan and I titled our book Racism, Not Race, because it was genocide, colonialism, and slavery which created our social definitions of race. Now, the social definitions of race also began on a special creationist foundation. Now, how were they different from that of the biological race concept? Well, socially defined race arbitrarily utilized aspects of morphology, geography, culture, language, religion, but only did so in the service of a social dominance hierarchy. In other words, this idea about race had no other reason to exist other than its role in the exploitation of other human beings. Now, because it is arbitrary, it is historically contextual, and it morphed through time depending upon the society in which these socially defined concepts were deployed for the purposes of maintaining systems of racial injustice. Now, we don't actually get a concept of human biological variation that was based in a scientific understanding of variation until the publication of On the Origin of Species by Charles Darwin in 1859. Now, most of you in this audience probably know that Darwin did not talk about humans in the origin. Now, Stephen Jay Gould would have told you that the main reason that Darwin didn't talk about humans in The Origin was that he wanted to stay out of or avoid the ire of the clergy. And that's certainly part of the story. But another part of the story, which is not so well known, is that Darwin was particularly concerned about the implications of common descent in the human species and how that would play with the Victorian hierarchy that he was a part of. In other words, people were not going to be happy to think about the fact that they shared common ancestry with their slaves and their servants. And so that was also a reason why Darwin kept away from humans in The Origin of Species. Now, he does come back to this question in The Descent of Man and Selection with Relation to Sex, which was published in 1871. And for those of you who have an interest, there is a program in February that's going to be held at Dartmouth College in which scholars like myself will be talking about the significance of the 150th anniversary of the publication of The Descent of Man. The reason it didn't occur in 21 is for obvious reasons. That was the pandemic. So anyway, let's move on. Now, Darwin's ideas alone are not enough or weren't enough to explain human biological variation. It required what we call the neo-Darwinian synthesis, which was the unification of natural selection theory with Mendelian genetics. And the purpose of this intellectual program was to question the origin, significance, and maintenance of geographical variation. Now, one of the architects of that synthesis, Ernst Mayr, noted that the term subspecies, which is equivalent to geographical race, had come into common usage in the 19th century, replacing the notion of the variety. And so when Linnaeus was writing about humans in the 10th edition of Systema Naturae, published in 1758, he used the term variety. Now, Mayr says, the concept of subspecies is fallacious. Species are not composites of uniform subtypes or subspecies, but consist of an almost infinite number of local populations, each in turn insexual species consisting of genetically different individuals. The difficulties of the subspecies concepts are intensified if one considers the subspecies not merely as a practical device of the taxonomist, but also as a unit of evolution. The better the geographical variation of the species is known, the more difficult it becomes to delimitate subspecies, and the more obvious it becomes that many such delimitations are quite arbitrary. And that's from Population, Species, and Evolution, which is an abridgment of the original Animal, Species, and Evolution. Now, for geographical or biological races to have some reality, one really needed a genetic tool to be able to determine how much genetic distance had been achieved from a common ancestor to say that two populations really had achieved this level that we would call the subspecies. Now, this was a problem that Sewell Wright addressed when he designed his F statistics, which allowed researchers to look at population differentiation at various levels from the local population to that of the entire species. So with regard to whether we can consider biological races, the correct level to look at is the population subdivision statistic, FST. Now, this is given for multiple genetic loci, as HT being the average of the expected heterozygosity in the total population over all loci, and HS is the average expected heterozygosity over the subpopulations. Now, if you look at the algebra of this expression, it should become clear to you that if the subpopulation heterozygosity is equal to the total population heterozygosity, then the numerator becomes 0, and there is no population subdivision. In this sense, you can think of the entire species as being a panmictic group with no local geographic variation of any significance. Now, on the other hand, if the heterozygosity of the subpopulations is extremely low, then FST will become 1, meaning that the populations are totally subdivided. And in that case, one would be absolutely legitimate in the classification of these subpopulations as, in fact, being biological or geographical races. Now, the nice thing about Wright's population subdivision statistics is it gives us the capacity to actually measure this genetic differentiation rather than making guesses based upon the physical appearance of the organisms in question. Now, let me give you an example. In the figure to the top left, you see 5 populations in this simulation who have allele frequencies that are very close to each other. And if you ran the FST calculation, you would get a number that's very low, and you would conclude, well, these populations clearly have shown no strong differentiation, and we shouldn't call them geographical races or subspecies. Now, the figure on the right shows an example of strong differentiation in allele frequency between subpopulations. This results in a high FST, and here we would be right to claim, yes, we are looking at strong local adaptation, differentiating these populations, and therefore adequately naming them as biological races or subspecies. Now, an example of a specific gene that shows really strong differentiation is MC1R, which plays a role in producing fair skin. Not surprisingly, it has a very high FST value between the temperate zone in Eurasia and tropical regions where people have very dark pigmented skin. And so therefore, we would generate a very high FST. But the important thing to recognize is we're only talking about one genetic locus, not the entire genome. Now, when we look at human adaptation, a recent adaptation since humans began their migration around the globe some 100,000 years ago, we can show genetic systems that clearly show evidence of strong local adaptation. And these specific systems are not surprising. In other words, things like lactase persistence in populations that domesticated cows, things like high fat diet for Arctic population, anti-malarial adaptations in malaria zones, skin pigmentation in the tropics and temperate zones, and so on. None of that is surprising. But one of the things I want to point out, and this will be something I'm sure I'll be asked about later in this presentation, is one thing should jump out at you if you know anything about genetics. The first thing is that this is actually a very small number of protein coding genes that show definitive, strong evidence of adaptation. There are 19,000 protein coding genes in the human genome, and we're looking at maybe 50 showing definitive, strong evidence of adaptation. These are also single gene systems. So we don't have a lot of examples of quantitative traits that are showing strong evidence of adaptations. Now, there is, for example, height in Northern Europe. The converse of that is the rainforest phenotype, which occurs in the rainforests of Central Africa and also in Brazil, in the Amazon basin in Brazil. But those are outstanding exceptions to the rule. Now, those of you who are familiar with my work or familiar with the controversies that I have been engaged in, You might remember that David Reich, the author of Who We Are and How We Got Here, decided to call me out in a lecture I gave at Harvard University in 2016, making claims about the certainty of complex adaptation in traits like intelligence and personality, even though at the time no one had demonstrated any evidence of differentiation in human populations in genes responsible for these complex traits. Well, good reason why. There's a good reason why we don't see that. And I explained that in subsequent publications after that lecture. Now, what we do know, however, is across the genome, population subdivision in humans is weak. Now, this is from a paper from Alan Templeton back in 2002. The dark black bar represents FST calculated from 24 medically important genes in humans. And the value in that study was about 0.156, showing extremely weak subdivision. Now, you will look at the species to the right of humans, things like white-tailed deer, gray wolves, Grant's gazelle, all with numbers well above 0.250, indicating, as Wright would have said, strong population differentiation. So for gray wolves, white-tailed deer, Grant's gazelle, you would be absolutely standing on legitimate ground to claim that those species do have biological races. And so I have often been misquoted in the press saying Graves says there's no such thing as race. I have never once said that. What I have consistently maintained in this discussion is that our species, anatomically modern humans, does not have biological races. I have never once said that other species of organisms could not have suites of adaptations which allowed them to be genetically differentiated from other populations in their species and be subspecies or geographic races. I've never once said that. What I've said is humans don't have biological races. And there's a really good reason for why we don't, which I'll explain subsequently. So with modern sequencing techniques, we can look at far more genetic loci than Alan could in his study. So this is an example of FST calculated between Africans and European samples across 5 chromosomes. And what we see here, N represents the specific loci that are included in the calculation. And for coding regions, those that produce protein, we find FST values at 0.08, 0.087, 0.07, 0.103, 0.098. Okay, these don't even come close to the threshold we would expect for strong genetic differentiation between Europeans and Africans. Now, the numbers go up when we look at the non-coding regions. And those of you with any familiarity in evolutionary genetics understand why that's true. Non-coding regions don't produce proteins and therefore don't face natural selection, and therefore their frequencies differ by genetic drift. And of course, since the majority of our genome is non-coding, as you see the much larger N in the non-coding segments of the genome in the study, okay, that allows us to be able to use such markers to determine genetic ancestry. But that doesn't say that phenotypically that Africans and Europeans are that dramatically different. They're not. Now, furthermore, if we look at the distribution of the FST statistic with geography, as in this bottom panel, it shows that there's a continuous change in FST values, which represents genetic differentiation between pairwise populations with geographic distance. Now, this flies against the notion that you could unambiguously apportion human populations into any sort of reasonable taxonomic categories. In other words, human genetic variation is continuous, rooted on East Africa, where our species began, throughout its 100,000-year migratory journey around the world. There's no simple way to say where one group begins and another group ends. Furthermore, if you look at the top panel, which shows the heterozygosity in populations with distance from East Africa, you see that that's a declining function, indicating that since our species, anatomically modern humans, spent most of its time in Africa before anyone left, it accumulated more genetic variation there, and because of genetic drift, lost variants as populations migrated around the world within the last 70 to 100,000 years. Now, David Reich, in his Who We Are and How We Got There, made the point, well, maybe there was, a lot of local genetic adaptation during that migration, and using, samples from ancient DNA makes a very solid case that that is in fact what did happen during that migration. But he also admits that after those migrations, gene flow between various human population centers was very high, and any local differentiation which appeared in the early phases of human genetic migration have been swamped out by gene flow. And that is what accounts for the continuous variation in FST that you see in the Lawson-Hanley study in 2007. So the long and short of it is, human genetic variation is continuous, it is not discrete, does not allow us to apportion groups into supposed races by any objective scientific means. Now, we also cannot use FST to support the existence of distinct clusters or unique evolutionary lineages. And these studies, which I list here, looking at the impact of geographic distance on FST, demonstrate that. So while there are effects of distance and barriers, it does not overwhelm the simple fact that the best predictor of genetic similarity is the geographic distance between the populations. Neither does the evolutionary relationship between human populations support any sort of continental clustering scheme, which you would need to try to claim that you had racial differentiation in our species. For example, pairwise FST between sub-Saharan African hunter-gatherers is greater than the distance between sub-Saharan African farmers and Europeans. East Africans and the Maasai are more similar to Europeans than they are to the Khoisan, who are South African hunter-gatherers. The Sandawe, who are hunter-gatherers in East Africa, are closer to Europeans than they are to the Hadza, who are farmers in East Africa. So all of these things fly in the face of the social definitions of race, in which most people would look at these people and say, oh, they're all Africans, they all have dark skin, and so therefore they should be closer genetically to each other than they are to Europeans, and that is in fact wrong. So now I'm gonna do a thought experiment with you and bring this talk to a close. So on a trip to Eastern Europe 2 years ago, I spoke at an international conference in Poland. What you might not know is that in Eastern Europe, their K-12 education system still teaches that there are 3 biological races in the world, essentially the white, yellow, and black. So let's imagine that they were true, that their claim was true. Well, how much genetic overlap would there be between these populations? Is it no genetic overlap? Okay, oops, I think my slides aren't showing. I'm sorry. I didn't expect this. I haven't used this platform. Some overlap, lots of overlap, even though you can't see these nice diagrams that I worked out. And so I'm going to ask you, which of these models do you think is correct? No overlap, some overlap, or lots of overlap? So you can mentally vote. I think you can throw those in the comments. And it turns out, okay, that the no overlap model is wrong. This represents a 19th century typological view of human biological variation. And unfortunately, this is very common today. We see this a lot, particularly in clinical medicine. I mean, I literally gave a talk at Duke University's radiology department this morning in which people were holding this 19th century typological view of human biological variation. Now, I have addressed these misconceptions in the last year in a couple of papers. One, Ongoing Racial Misconceptions in Medical Education in the New England Journal of Medicine, and also one that came out in March of 2022, Race in the Reading, a study of problematic uses of race and ethnicity in a prominent pediatrics textbook. Now, it turns out that after our publication of Race in the Reading, in which we examined the textbook of the American Academy of Pediatrics, that academy a few days later came out with a statement against racial medicine. Now, they didn't credit us for changing their mind, but the coincidence is a little too big to think that our paper did not influence their thinking. Now, some overlap. Turns out that that's also wrong. Okay, so this is the population genetic model that would tell you that there's some overlap. And this was a view that was actually based upon the work of Richard Lewontin's more genetic variation within than between populations work from 1972. This was a common view of genetic variation in the 1990s. It turns out that that's wrong. Okay. The new data suggests, in fact, that this is the correct model of human biological variation. European populations and Asian populations are a subset of the genetic variability found in Africans. Now, this becomes clear because recent evolution outside of Africa between 100 to 70,000 years ago, genetic diversity was actually lost, whereas humans stayed in Africa for a much longer period of time, around 300,000 years, which allowed them to accumulate more genetic variation, okay, through time than that which was lost in Europeans and Asians during their migration to their current geographical locales. So the best way to understand our species is sort of like thinking of it in terms of nested dolls, with Africans representing the biggest doll and all of the other populations being subsets of African genetic diversity. So finally, another point that's particularly significant when we think about how race has been deployed in biomedical research and clinical practice is the lack of understanding that colonialism and slavery actually created new populations in the Western Hemisphere. For example, people who are identified as African American on average have 16% European ancestry because of slavery. Now, we know that this, by the way, genetic admixture was unidirectional in the sense of American race laws, and also by being able to sequence Y chromosomes and show that there is a differential amount of European Y chromosomes in African Americans, and there's virtually no African Y chromosomes in European Americans. And this, again, resulted because African women had no control over their bodies during chattel slavery. Now, however, when we look at this admixture, it differs by geographical region. So in parts of the Southeast, it's actually less than 16%. But in West Virginia, it's closer to 30% European ancestry. In Washington State, it's over than 25% European ancestry in people socially defined as Africans. Now, Latinos represent an even greater complexity because they represent a triad mixture between Africans, Europeans, and Amerindian populations. So, for example, in Puerto Rico, on average, okay, the average Puerto Rican has 72% European ancestry, 16% Amerindian ancestry, and 12% African ancestry. Whereas in Mexico, 51% Amerindian ancestry, 48% European ancestry, and only about 3% African ancestry. In Peru, again, the average is 80% Amerindian ancestry and only 18% European ancestry. Although there are pockets of populations in Peru who are Afro-Peruvians who have 80% African ancestry and much less American Indian or European ancestry. Finally, in a country like Colombia, 64% European ancestry, 29% American Indian ancestry, and only about 7% African ancestry. But to show the complexity of this issue within Colombia, if you look at the city of Benayin, the admixture profile looks very much like that of the nation as a whole. But if you look at the neighboring state of Chocó, which was a center of plantation agriculture, you see a triad mixture that is somewhat similar to what we see in African Americans. In other words, about 80% African ancestry, but in Chocó, there's a much higher percentage of American Indian ancestry than you would see in African Americans. So I'm going to end my comments today by talking about a controversy which I was involved in October of 2022. And this paper came out, this opinion piece came out in Scientific American. And the title is Why Scientists Must Stand for Affirmative Action and Against Scientific Racism. And if you are unaware, the Supreme Court is deciding now that it may destroy affirmative action in higher education. And I was interviewed for this article, and my position is this. Should the Supreme Court overturn Gruninger versus Bollinger, thus essentially ending affirmative action at historically white institutions of higher education, they must simultaneously order that all states who violated the 1879 Plessy versus Ferguson decision by siphoning funds away from Black education to support white education must immediately pay those pilfered funds into Black public school districts and historically Black colleges and universities. Furthermore, they must order that going forward, a moonshot level investment in the infrastructure of HBCUs, Hispanic serving institutions, and minority serving institutions and tribal colleges must be put in place to meet the need for equitable education for non-whites in the United States. Now, for those of you who are unfamiliar with Plessy versus Ferguson, that Supreme Court decision came after the violent defeat of Reconstruction in the former Confederate states. It claimed that you could have separate social institutions so long as they were funded equally. Turns out that that never happened in those states. To give you an example of how great the disparity is, we have calculated at my institution that the state of North Carolina owes us at least $1.3 billion in funds that they stole from us to put into white education. Now, I can tell you that if you were to give me $1.3 billion right now, I could make a huge dent in the demography of modern science. The reason we can't is because we don't have the infrastructure that colleges like Chapel Hill, North Carolina State have. So, as I said, when I give these talks, they are assiduously documented. So Here are some of the references we just used to support the points within. And I leave you with a picture of my research group from 2018. For any of you who are familiar with what the demography looks like at evolutionary biology conferences, you will admit that you've never seen a group like this at an evolution conference before. And this is what we do. And imagine what I could do if I had the appropriate infrastructure to do more. Thank you for your attention, and I'm happy to answer any of your questions.
Thanks, Joe. You have definitely given us a lot to think about. I particularly was pleased. I'm sorry. There's a lot of thoughts just there swirling around my head right now. I have on a number of occasions given talks to general public groups like ours about the concept of race. And I really like the way you did this, explaining very clearly Fisher's FST concepts and how the heterozygosity varies over different groups and the relationship of this to the impossibility of forming discrete clusters of human beings. I think I find that very persuasive. I may actually try to integrate some of that into my future talks. I tend to be much more historical. Speaking of history, while Jay lines up some questions, and I had YouTube on another screen, and we do have a lot of questions out there, and he's trying to make sense of them. But I'm also interested, as I think many of our listeners are, in the history of how we came to believe as we do about human variation. Obviously, human variation occurs as just not packaged in nice little discrete historical units, shall we say, as Ernst Mayr has pointed out. I was wondering if you are familiar with Morris and Desmond's book, Darwin's Sacred Cause.
Yeah, of course I am.
Yeah. I find for those of you listening, Jim Morris and Desmond Morris and Jim Moore and Morris, it gets confusing there, are a couple of scholars in Great Britain who have written some very good Darwin biographies. Jim Moore is a very good scholar of the whole scientific community in the late 1800s. In their book, Darwin's Sacred Cause, they propose the idea that it was the very strong current in the Darwin family that went, back a couple generations, not just his generation, toward anti-slavery and emancipation. Darwin himself, as well as his parents, donated to the anti-slavery movement in the United States. They followed the American Civil War very, very closely. They were extraordinarily interested in what was going on in our country in the 1860s and 70s. And Desmond and Morris believe that this sentiment, shall we say, that the Darwins felt very strongly about, whether they were from the religious tradition or whether they were from the free thought tradition of Darwin's father. They were, both sides of the family were unified that slavery had to go. And that this was a very strong motivation for shaping his views on evolution. Do you have any thoughts about that?
More shaping his views about human evolution, not
specifically
evolution. Period. Yeah, and I do, and I've actually written extensively on. I spent a lot of time in my first book, The Emperor's New Clothes, talking about Darwin's aunts who were big anti-slavery activists. His grandfather, Josiah Wedgwood, designed the British anti-slavery medal. His disputes with Fitzroy on the voyage of the Beagle about how people were treated around the world. The famous quote, "Great is our sin," and so on. So, and that's work that I do particularly because, many racially subordinated communities start out with the impression that evolutionary science is the enemy. And in fact, you probably remember in the late 1990s when creationists attempted to claim that Charles Darwin was the father of scientific racism.
They still do. That hasn't
Yeah,
ended.
well, I mean, I testified in Louisiana in front of the Louisiana State Legislature, pointing out that, in fact, scientific racism began with Christians. And that's really well discussed in Terence Keel's book, Divine Variations, which shows that those racial ideas begin with people like Paracelsus and the pre-Adamite races, and were completely inculcated in Christian theology associated with the slave institutions, particularly in the American South. So it turns out that Darwin was one of the good guys, not one of the bad guys, with regard to the institution of slavery, and also providing us with the tools to debunk the claims on which racism reside. And the first claim is that there are these discrete groups that we can define as biological races.
Yeah.
And
we can't.
Evolutionary genetics shows that that's simply not true.
Yeah. And they're not permanent. Their human variation is continuous, both in time and geography. It changes over time as well as changes over space, and it just cannot be clumped into tidy little groups that we think of as
I
races.
love the one that I'm seeing in the chat. I find it really hard to believe that there's been no change in brain size over 300,000 years. So, that all sounds like the J. Philippe Rushton nonsense, which I spent decades debunking. So for people who think that, there's been this substantial change in brain size within anatomically modern humans, and that's somehow related to differences in human cognition, you really should read my work on that. In particularly showing that Rushton's life history evolution theory was backwards. In fact, if Rushton actually believed, and you can see my debate with Rushton on YouTube, so just look up Graves Rushton debate.
Oh, that sounds interesting.
Yeah, in which I point out that he didn't know life history theory at all, and that in fact, if he had deployed the MacArthur and Wilson life history theory, he would have come to the conclusion that it would have been Africans with the big brains and higher intelligence, and Eurasians with the smaller brains and greater investment in reproduction. So there's a whole lot of folks running around with these, quack ideas about human life history evolution that are not at all based in any sort of real science.
Yeah, well, that certainly is true. I know, but to your point that you mentioned earlier, Darwin was really the good guy, but an awful lot of Black citizens have been fed the line that he was actually the father of eugenics, the father of racism, et cetera, et cetera. I know that when I would go on talk radio in cities where there was a substantial Black population, or where the show was, maybe the radio station catered, especially, Detroit or Chicago or Oakland and places like that. Always, every single time, somebody would call up and say, "What about that Darwin guy?" And it's great if you have the opportunity to testify like you did, and you can go into into more of the details of why this idea is wrong, and from history, from science, and everything else.
Yeah, but
generally
there's also the big problem that pointing fingers at individuals is sort of not very useful at all. Whether Charles Darwin was on the right side of history or not is really sort of irrelevant. What is relevant from the point of view of people who have been racially subordinated is the activity of the scientific enterprise. And I distinguish.
Which has had its ups and downs, after all. Let's face it.
I would say for us, more downs than ups. And that's the thing.
When I would
have a hard time accepting that the way the scientific enterprise has been deployed contributes to the racial subordination of Black and brown people around the world. Now, that doesn't mean that the scientific method isn't true. In fact, the reason the scientific enterprise can be so powerful in the way it influences society is because the scientific method works. it does produce things
Yeah.
that you can then use as applications. And those applications in the hands of a racially segregated and hierarchical society provides power for those who control that society to then influence the lives of those who don't. And so I've spent a lot of time, and that my colleagues have spent a lot of time talking about that. You can see that in our paper in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences that came out last year called Inequality in Science and the Case for a New Agenda, in which we say that we will never see significant numbers of Black and brown people in science until the agenda gets changed.
Well, what I would say when I would get those calls, somebody going on and on about how terrible Darwin was and what a racist he was and so forth, and not having a lot of time to explain the science, is I had a fairly brief little line that I would use before we'd cut to commercial, because they never, they always cut you off anyway. And I would say, well, first of all, the modern genetically based theory of evolution is your best bulwark against racism. And with the hope that that would at least crack the door a little bit and get them thinking about, and then maybe the next time they heard a little bit more about evolution or genetics, they would maybe learn a little bit more. But there's a great deal of ignorance here about, well, the subject of your latest book. They don't realize how useful evolutionary biology is for dealing with.
I can tell you that there are people who do, and
Yeah.
those people are in the picture I showed at the end of my
Yes.
presentation.
Yeah.
So one of the things we have been able to do, when I came to North Carolina A&T back in 2005, I made the intentional decision to leave historically white institutions. And for those of you in the audience who don't know my history, make it clear to you that I did not do my education in historically Black institutions. I did not receive tenure in historically Black institutions. I received my tenure at a Research One historically white institution. And I spent over half of my career in Research One institutions before I decided to move to an HBCU, because I felt that those students needed to have the opportunity to be instructed by people like me. And in the short time that I have been at North Carolina A&T, well, it's not short anymore, we have produced more African-American PhDs in evolutionary biology than the entire rest of the country. Just to give you an example, in December, we graduated 2 women in experimental evolution in the same year, 2 African-American women in experimental evolution in the same year. That's never happened at any other institution.
Yeah.
And the reason it happens is because someone who can present evolution as a powerful tool to solve significant problems of interest and of need in historically underserved communities is there doing it. And we have a pipeline going where for the next decade,
that infrastructure,
most of the scientists in evolutionary biology that are African-American will likely come out of our institution.
Okay, so I've been monopolizing you for too long, I'm sorry to say. We really need to let some of our listeners have some have a chance to talk with you as well. Bill Chapman asks, does the statement "race is not a scientific concept" include the assertion that there can be no differences in average phenotype between populations other than the purely cosmetic?
Absolutely not.
If not, what is the point of saying race is not a scientific concept?
Well, first off, I want to be clear. I never say that. I've never said that. Okay. The concept of race developed, the biological concept of race developed with the biology, looking at variation within species. And, it has a long history and it's intellectually difficult. And it's gone through numerous definitions. So it has some utility, because what you're talking about is basically some amount of adaptation from a common ancestor that differentiates populations. But then the question is, well, exactly how much differentiation do you need before you say that this is a geographical race or subspecies? Now, taxonomists have argued about that for decades. Now, I find it a really sort of fruitless discussion, because what's really interesting from an evolutionary point of view is what the nature of those adaptations are
Mhm.
and what direction they're going. Now, again, I stand by the point that with regards to our species, okay, gene flow has greatly overwhelmed any local adaptation that has occurred. And that's why we never formed biological races.
Mhm.
So, yeah, I mean, it is a scientific concept. It's a difficult one with regard to definitions.
And
One,
especially difficult to apply to humans.
yeah, and it's
It
difficult to
works
apply
better for song sparrows and wolves.
yeah, it's difficult to apply to most species. Again, it comes down to, why did Wright choose a specific threshold? There's a theoretical reason for why the value 0.250 was chosen by Wright. I didn't know Sewell Wright, but I knew a lot of people who did know him. And his argument had to do with the probability of fixation of different alleles in populations at that level of genetic differentiation. So it's a reasonable number, but again, it's arbitrary.
Yeah.
So the real question is, what is the nature of adaptation, and what does that tell you about where the species is going and whether they're going to form new species? And in the case of humans, that's just not really an issue.
Howard Wynette wants to know, is there evidence that medical schools are receptive to training physicians to being able to enter the drive to replace race with genealogy in their patients' default thinking? You mentioned in your talk that there are problematic aspects for medical education in terms of the concept of race. I think Howard is maybe getting towards that, is replacing the concept of race with genealogy or at least lineage or heredity, a way of coping, of dealing with that, do you think?
Well, first, let's outline the degree of the problem, because it's a huge problem. And so for the last 3 years, I've been deeply engaged in trying to change medical education with regard to human biological variation. So in 2016, a PNAS paper came out of the University of Virginia's medical school with regard to the beliefs that their medical students had about human biological variation and race. And they were absurd. And not only were they absurd, they were dangerous. So,
Yeah.
for example, you had medical students believing that black skin was thicker than white skin. You had them believing that black nerve endings were less sensitive than white nerve endings. And so on the wards, the residents were not giving black patients pain medication
Yeah.
when they should have been giving them pain medication, because they had this false belief about human biological variation. So that's sort of the tip of the iceberg. In the last time period, I've done with my colleague, Dr. Andrea Dayrup, who's a professor of pathology at Duke University, we've done over 45 grand round lectures at America's leading medical schools on the West Coast, in the Midwest, in the Northeast, in the South. We've spoken before the National Board of Medical Examiners. As I said, we published papers which caused the American Academy of Pediatrics to change their view with regard to racial medicine. So there is reception to the fact that medicine is doing human biological variation wrong. And I'm going to make this last point on this. So imagine you had engineers who were building bridges, and you found out that the engineers weren't using Newtonian principles to build the structures, and that they were, using astrology. If the nation found out about that, there would be inquiries. People would be going to jail. Okay? But that's exactly what medicine has been doing with human biological variation. They have been using 19th century typological thinking, and it has led to harming patients. Now, again, who's being harmed? Well, racial medicine doesn't harm you if you're white, for the most part, because most of the tests are done on persons of European descent. But it does harm people who are black and brown. And since the majority of physicians are white, and only about 3% of them, 3 to 5% of them are black and brown, okay, this system has been allowed to perpetuate. And now the system is seeing the light of day, and medical schools and medical curricula are now scrambling to fix what they should have fixed 100 years ago.
Better late than never. Jay, Desert File Well, I'm also a desert-phile. How does one map geographical races chronologically? At what point is a race a new race in time?
Well, again, that would depend upon the species in question, right? And again, what is your criterion? So the two criteria that are used in modern biology is the amount of genetic variation within groups versus between them, and that's measured by FST. The other criterion is whether any group can be considered a unique evolutionary lineage. Okay, and that's basically achieved using phylogenetic methods. So, at some point you have a new species that comes to existence in some point in some geographical range. The forces of evolutionary change go to work, natural selection, genetic drift. Some group gets isolated, causing gene flow to reduce. They start diverging in allele frequencies. And at some point, they're different enough so that you might be able to say this is a unique evolutionary lineage, or the genetic distance between that group and the others is great enough to say, oh yeah, now you have a subspecies or geographical race. Now, but to do that, right, you have to be able to follow that population from start to finish, and in terms of the natural world, we really don't have studies like that. Yeah. So, and no one's, by the way, ever been able to do something like that in the laboratory. So again, it might be an interesting question, but I just don't know how we would study that in the real world.
I mean, it's hard enough to put lines around species in many areas, much less subspecies through time. Peter M. asks, can Joe talk about the concept known as Lewontin's fallacy? His book cites Lewontin on genetic variation within and among groups, but fails to mention the criticism known as Lewontin's fallacy.
Well, there's a reason why I failed to mention the criticism of Lewontin's fallacy, is because it itself is a fallacy. In fact, I was the one who demonstrated that Armand Leroy, by the way, who was a graduate student in the laboratory of one of my close collaborators, and I've got I think his guy was Wynn Edwards. He was one of
Wynn Edwards.
Yeah, he was one of R.A. Fisher's students. Yeah, the eugenicist. So the idea of Lewontin's fallacy is a fallacy, and basically what they're saying is, okay, Lewontin says that there's more genetic variation within groups versus between groups that are defined as races. But when Edwards says, okay, but we can find loci that show strong FST, and nobody disagrees with that. Lewontin didn't say that there weren't loci within populations that are differentiated strongly at specific places. Okay, whether one names something a subspecies doesn't depend upon one locus. So basically, Lewontin's fallacy is a fallacy, which is why I didn't talk about it, because it's a ridiculous argument. It goes back to Dobzhansky's idea, and I'm actually a lineal descendant of Dobzhansky and Lewontin. And basically, Dobzhansky thought I forgot the name of the book, but Dobzhansky thought that any local adaptation would be sufficient to name a geographical race. And if you use Dobzhansky's reasoning, which is essentially what Wynn Edwards and Armand Leroy were doing when they coined this term, Lewontin's fallacy, then virtually every genetic adaptation within every species would allow you to name a specific race. And so there'd be thousands and thousands of geographical races in virtually every species, showing the absolute lack of utility of the concept.
Bill Chapman asks, what we now consider to be different ethnicities were in isolation from one another. Doesn't this mean that genetic differences between ethnicities and cognition and behavior is probable?
First, let's be clear on definitions. Ethnic groups differ in culture. So people confuse ethnicity with biological variation, and the two can be correlated with each other, but they're not necessarily correlated with each other. And so the core false assumption of psychometry is the idea that because populations differ in allele frequencies at one locus, let's say skin color, or the 6 that determine primary loci determine skin color, that they must therefore also differ at other loci that are associated with complex behavior like personality and intelligence. That argument is nonsensical. And I spent a great deal of time in Racism, Not Race demonstrating why that's nonsensical. And in a paper written in response to David Reich, who seemed to think that I don't understand selection on complex traits, even though I spent my entire career doing selection experiments on complex traits. Yeah, but there's no reason why they would have to. And no one has ever demonstrated that they do. For example, in 2016, I was in a debate with Charles R. Murray at Williams College, and he said the exact same thing. Okay, because they differ in frequencies, therefore don't they differ in frequencies that have something to do with cognition and behavior? Well, they might, but you have to demonstrate that. You can't just say, oh yeah, okay, well sure, there is correlated selection. So let's say we do selection on malaria resistance. It could have a correlated effect on other aspects of the phenotype, but you have to create a mechanistic explanation of what that is. And then you have to test that hypothesis. And then, again, I thought this was a skeptic society in which we, did this thing called, the testing of hypotheses with evidence. And so people like Reich, people like Murray, the entire psychometrician program, they've all made these claims that are basically correlative. And when they attempt to come up with evolutionary explanations like J. Philippe Rushton did, they fall flat on their face, like the winter selection theory, which, sort of claims that, hold on, I've got.
You have an interesting ringtone there.
So the winter selection theory, which somehow claimed that, there was something much more difficult about human populations adapting to winter conditions as opposed to tropical ones, even though, for example, Africa has 8 climatic zones with different fall and vegetational types. It's just sheer nonsense. And really it just is a what's the word I'm looking for? It reifies, the social dynamics of societies. Yeah. We're here because we're smarter. And you can always, attempt to find these, ad hoc explanations for why we must be smarter. Oh yeah, sure. But if we do this on the basis of, like, for example, GWAS, genome-wide association studies, which have been done on, European populations and 1.2 million individuals, and finding the genomic contribution to intelligence is less than 7%. Okay. So 93% is other, 7% is genetic. And then when intelligence testing didn't work, they jumped to educational attainment. And that's a really objective phenotype.
Right, yeah.
But then even you jump to educational attainment is like 13, 14%. So you've got 86% not explained, by GWAS.
Yeah.
And again, that's only in European populations, not in the rest of the world, which has different linkage relationships. And so those studies wouldn't tell us anything about anybody else anyway.
Well, the claim of the psychometricians, like I haven't taught this in 40 years probably by this time, but it always seemed to me that the extraordinary claim that they were making is that populations of human groups differ in their average mental, behavioral, et cetera, capacity. Obviously, individuals vary. I know lots of people who are a lot smarter than I am. I also know people who are not as smart as I am. There's variation within, among human beings, right? But whether populations of human beings, however you are going to draw those boundaries, differ on average is a statement that they're going to have a lot of trouble supporting theoretically. One argument, which I think is what the questioner kind of had in mind, is that, well, so many other things that human beings, groups of human beings vary. We vary in skin color, we vary in lactase sufficiency, we vary in this, that, and the other thing. We have all these examples of natural selection for these various properties. Why not also for mental capacity?
And I explained that, which is
Exactly.
the
And at the same
examples
time,
given are single Mendelian genes.
yeah, I know. I mean,
not complex traits.
it's an ignorant point of view, but just speaking theoretically without using specific examples, since natural selection works in all these other morphological and biochemical characters, why not also?
And here's another one, Jeannie, which I
But,
point out
but
in the book.
theoretically also, we could similarly say that given the nature of evolution, given the nature of human beings and how intelligence and problem solving ability, whatever you want to call it, our mental capacities are what provide our adaptations to the environments in which we find each other. We are not dependent upon sharp teeth and long claws. We are dependent on this. So one would imagine, one doesn't have to imagine, one would theoretically predict that any reasonably large size group of human beings would be able to reconstitute the whole range of variation of human intellectual capacities. There would be
Yeah.
smart people, dumb people, middle people, and so forth. And that is what you'd expect theoretically. Now,
And,
if you actually look at
there's
the other,
another point
yeah.
theoretically that you would also predict that psychometricians don't seem to get, which is I can't imagine any environment that exists on the planet where the ability to think critically and problem solve wouldn't contribute to those individuals' fitness.
Yeah.
And that's where the nonsense of the winner selection theory comes in, that somehow you have to be a better thinker to deal with winter than you have to be a better thinker to deal with the tropics and rainy season. That's
in
nonsense.
which case the smartest people are Inuits.
Yeah.
I mean, and when you look at their culture, you begin to believe it. At any rate, I think we have one more question before we are really going to run out of time. Mitch Diamond asks, how do you label or name the specific demographic populations necessary to include in clinical trials, especially when certain groups have higher rates of inherited diseases or other predispositions?
Okay. So, I mean, again, what we know about human genetic variation is that it's geographically based. So, if you have a group of people from Finland, okay, you could call them Finns. If you have a group of people from England, call them English. If you have a group of people from Russia, you can call them Russians. Okay, so that gets us closer to where those populations are on the spectrum of human genetic variation. You use terms like white, black, okay? It doesn't tell you a whole lot with regard to genetic predisposition, particularly when you consider, like, for example, Africa. There's more genetic variability in Africa than all the rest of the human species combined. So when I talk about humans, and in fact, we do a chapter in Racism Not Race called Race Names and Race Mixing, in which we talk about how you should come up with a nomenclature that actually reflects biological variation and not socially defined groups. And when you talk about higher rates of inherited disease, the first thing you need to recognize is that, for serious genetic conditions, those are driven by mutation selection balance. So they're extremely rare. So we got in an argument with the editors of Robbins' Basic Pathology, which I helped to edit over the last 2 years, on the difference in a specific carcinoma found in African Americans and European Americans. And so for European Americans, the rate was 6 per 1,000. And in African Americans, the rate was 12 per 1,000. The other editors thought that that was an important thing to report in the book. The difference between 6 per 1,000 and 12 per 1,000 has absolutely no clinical significance. And if it is a difference, it's not a difference that results from selection, it's a difference that results from drift.
Yeah.
So why would you want to report that? But what we found in the book is that almost every example of where rare prevalence diseases were being reported were ones in which Africans or African Americans or Blacks had the higher prevalence and Europeans had the lower prevalence, which was the basis for my article in the journal Genealogy last year called The Myth of the Genetically Sick African. because the medical community is presenting a narrative of how the African genome is somehow, corrupted with all these diseases, even though when we do a genome-wide study of Africans and Europeans, it turns out the Europeans are the ones that have the highest load of deleterious mutations, not Africans.
Thank you. All right. It's getting very late on the East Coast. We very much appreciate you spending time out here on the West with us. We're just sort of barely creeping up to 9 o'clock, and it's probably time to tuck in the cat and say goodnight to you, Joe. I want to thank you very much for spending this time with us. And your talk will be posted immediately after we hang up, so to speak, and will be available for all to see, which I think is going to enlighten many. I will thank you again, and for the rest of you, I would like to encourage you to join us next month, the second Thursday, for Dr. Jennifer Reich speaking on the cultural logic of vaccine refusal. Goodness knows it's a topic that we need to learn more about. And Jennifer, as an epidemiologist, knows a lot about this topic. So please join us the second Thursday of February 9th, 7:30 p.m. And to find the abstract and discussion of her talk, go to bit.ly/BOSS REIC. Thank you. And Joe, thanks again. Good night, everybody, and come see us next month. Good night.